So let me just start out and give a kind of an overview of the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 1 is what I call the prophetic history of Daniel. I mean, it gives kind of Daniel's life there in Babylon. And then chapters 2 through 7 in the book of Daniel give the prophetic history of the times of the Gentiles, of the time when Israel is going to be under Gentile domination. And then in chapters 8 to 12, we get the prophetic history of Israel during the times of the Gentiles. So chapters 2 through 7 are a really unique section in the book of Daniel. And one of the things that's interesting is they're in a different language. They're not in the Hebrew language. Beginning in chapter 2 and verse 4, all the way through chapter 7, the language changes. It's written in what's called the Aramaic language, which was the language of that day that many people would have understood. But Daniel chapters 2 to 7 are in a structure that's called a chiasm. You may have never heard of that before, but a chiasm is a structure where you have something here and something here that relate to one another, and then you kind of move towards the middle. And each section relates to the other section kind of that opposes it. So let me kind of explain how I see this. You think about Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. In Daniel chapter 2, you have these Gentile world powers pictured as different metals in an image that Nebuchadnezzar sees in a dream. You have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, pictured by gold, silver, bronze, and then by these legs of iron in this image. Then you go to chapter 7, and you have those same empires, but those are presented there as wild beasts. It's kind of interesting. I think in Daniel 2, it kind of presents these empires from the human viewpoint. In Daniel 7, they're presented from God's viewpoint. Here in Daniel 2, it's kind of this majestic image that we have. And in chapter 7, it's wild beasts. That's how God pictures these Gentile powers. But you have the same thing. You have a bear, you have a lion, a bear, a leopard, and then this beast with 10 horns. So you have the same thing presented in chapter 2 and chapter 7 from different viewpoints. Then when you go to chapter 3 and chapter 6, in chapter 3, you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you remember, who refused to bow down to the image created by King Nebuchadnezzar. Remember in chapter 2 of the book of Daniel that the gold represents the Babylonian Empire and King Nebuchadnezzar. And God says to Nebuchadnezzar, after you, there's going to come another kingdom that's represented by the silver. Now, I think Nebuchadnezzar, when he heard that, immediately thought, there's never going to be another kingdom after me. So he makes an image that's all of gold. And it wouldn't surprise me if the image didn't look like him. So he makes this image, and everybody has to come and bow down to this image. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't bow down because it would violate the first and the second commandments, and God supernaturally preserves them. So Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, you have the image, the metals in the image and these beasts. Chapter 3, you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapter 6, you have Daniel in the lion's den. So King Darius, remember, makes a decree that for 30 days, no one can pray to anyone or worship anyone other than him. Daniel continues to pray to Yahweh, and he's thrown into the lion's den, but he's supernaturally protected by God. So it's kind of the same as chapter 3, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, remember, they don't do something that the king tells them to do. But in chapter 6, Daniel does something that the king tells him not to do. So they're kind of opposites. But then you go to chapter 4 and 5. This is kind of the middle of this chiasm. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is humbled by God. He's lifted up in pride. God turns him into a wild beast for 7 years. And then in chapter 5, you have his grandson, Belshazzar, who lifts himself up in pride, and Babylon is destroyed and replaced by the Medo-Persian Empire. So you can see in this chiasm how these fit together. Chapter 2 and 7 go together. Chapter 3 and chapter 6 go together. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 go together. And that's kind of a little bit of a hidden structure that many people don't see when they look at the book of Daniel. But what I want to show you is kind of in this middle part here. There's really some hidden prophecies here, some typology or pattern where there's a prophetic message that's hidden or embedded in these chapters. So What we have here in these chapters, especially 3 through 6, is some prophetic implications. Let me explain what these are. In chapter 3, you have Nebuchadnezzar, who I think is a picture, kind of a foreshadow of the Antichrist, and he makes a decree that everybody in the world has to bow down to an image. Well, that should remind us of Revelation chapter 13, which is actually the passage we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes in the last half of this program. Revelation 13, the last part of that chapter, what happens? The Antichrist has an image made that everybody in the world has to bow down to. And if you don't bow down to that image, you're going to be killed. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't bow down to the image, and they're preserved by God. Well, what we have in the book of Revelation is the Antichrist, kind of the final Nebuchadnezzar makes this image, but there are people that don't bow down to him, but they're preserved by God. There's a believing Jewish remnant that's preserved by God during the tribulation period, supernaturally protected by him. When you go to chapter 6 of the book of Daniel, kind of the counterpart to chapter 3, you have Daniel, you have King Darius saying, no one can worship anyone or pray to anybody for 30 days except me. So you have another decree that's made. Daniel violates that decree, but God protects him supernaturally. So it's a prophetic foreshadow of what's going to happen during the tribulation. The Antichrist will make a decree, just like Nebuchadnezzar did, just like Darius did. But a believing Jewish remnant and some Gentiles will refuse to worship. They'll be persecuted, but many of them will be divinely protected by God, supernaturally protected by the Lord. Well, then the very center of this chiasm is chapter 4 and chapter 5. What do you have in those two chapters? You have a world ruler, Nebuchadnezzar. You have his grandson, Belshazzar. They lift themselves up in pride against God. And what happens? They're destroyed by God. They're brought low by him. They're judged by God. There's retribution. It's very, very sudden that comes upon them. That's a foreshadow or a prophetic picture of what will happen to the Antichrist. But Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar are just kind of prototypes or pictures of what the final Antichrist will be like. And he shows that God in the end is going to bring down all these world rulers who claim to be God in the end times, ultimately the Antichrist. So when you read these stories in the book of Daniel, chapter 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, it's kind of easy to just read these as kind of, bedtime stories for children. But these stories, while they do have wonderful application to our lives in being courageous and bold and standing for God and not having pride in our lives, underneath all of that, kind of hidden or embedded there, are these prophetic implications. It's a picture of the Antichrist.